Hey everyone, and welcome back to Remember This Tech. Today we're going to show you how to build your first PC. Now, building your PC may seem a little bit intimidating at first, but after the step-by-step guidance that I'm going to show you in this video, almost anyone can do it. I'll go over the key components you'll need to build most any computer, the tools you'll need, and I'll go into a little depth about just why it's so important not to skimp and cheap out on some key components for your computer build. I'll show you step by step on how to assemble your PC and throw in some tips and tricks of things I've learned over the years that'll help you avoid a few potential problems. I'm going for a mid-range computer build that can do a little bit of everything, from gaming to word processing, web browsing, and even some video editing. The key components for every computer build are a processor or CPU, they're interchangeable terms, a motherboard, memory or RAM, a hard drive, video card, a power supply, and a case to put it all into. And of course, you can choose what monitor do you want, or keyboard and mouse. Those are called peripherals, and those choices are as wide as the day is long. So it's completely up to you for those things, and I won't be covering them, but you'll need them regardless. I'll go over each of these components, and I'll discuss a little bit about what to look for in choosing the components for each that are best for you for your build. To start off, you're going to need a few basic tools. Everyone should probably have most of these tools lying around their house. You need a Phillips screwdriver with a medium-sized head, and those will be used for your case screws and power supply mounting and stuff like that. Then you're going to need a fine tip Phillips head screwdriver. Mainly, this is used for really small screws that you'll need to mount things like maybe your motherboard screws, and maybe the mounting of your NVMe drive, which is in your motherboard, that's really small. So I recommend a good little tool kit with a bunch of different bits, something like this, and you can use it for more than just building your PC. Then you're going to need at least a 16 gig fast USB memory stick. 32, 64, whatever you have, just make sure that it's one that you don't mind erasing. And what we are going to do with this is, I'll show you later on, is this is where you're going to put your operating system, Windows 10 or Windows 11, your choice, and you're going to install your operating system on your new computer on your hard drive with this. And we'll go into that later. But those are the three key things that you'll need for this build for as far as tools. For the build today, I've chosen the middle-of-the-road PC, as I said before. I'm going to go over each of the components that I chose and a little bit about why I chose them and why they're critically important to any PC build. The main part of your PC that you should never skimp on or cheap out on is the power supply. Now, why would I say that? A power supply needs to be able to deliver power to all of your components, your CPU, your video card, your hard drives, everything in your computer, motherboard, etc. If your power supply isn't a quality one, it can deliver incorrect voltages, causing problems throughout your entire computer, and could even cause it to fail and short out some of your other components, which could lead to a big problem, because then you would have to possibly replace the whole thing. Always choose a name brand power supply that has good reviews and should be spec'd with a little bit more power than what your system needs to have. Now, I'm going to link in the description below, and I'll show you right now, there are power calculators that you can add all your components and help you decide how much your PC is going to use and what your power supply should be rated for or spec for. Like.com, you can find their power supply wattage calculator. Pretty easy. You just put in the number of CPUs, you choose your CPU manufacturer, depending on what you're using, put in the series or socket for the motherboard that you're using, and choose your CPU model. And you do the same thing for your GPU. Then you're going to choose how many hard drives or SSDs are in your system, number of physical hard drives here, and then calculate. And then it'll show you a number of power supplies that will fit your needs for your build. In this case, it's recommending 750 watt power supplies as the base minimum, and they go up from there. And you can tweak it further by going with the bronze power supply or gold, depending on how fancy you want to get, and even your warranty. Many other manufacturers have a power supply wattage calculator. For this build, we have a Corsair 650 watt 80 plus bronze power supply. Now, I personally recommend Corsair power supplies, and I like Cooler Master. EVGA is a good brand as well, but there are many others that also produce quality power supplies. When I say 650, I mean 650 watts. That's the peak power output it's going to provide to your system. Now, when you put in your components on the online calculator for your wattage for your system that I gave you, you want to make sure that if you have a system that's going to consume under peak load of 350 or 400 watts, you need to have some headroom, at least 200 watts above that. So you need a 550 to 650 watt power supply, because your power supply is not going to be running 100% all the time. You're not going to be playing the most intensive game 24 hours a day. You're not going to be editing videos every day. And when you do these high intensity things, they pull more power from your power supply. That's why you need a buffer of a little bit of headroom so your power supply is not working overtime 100% all the time. Plus, if you want to add stuff later, like a better video card, it's probably going to pull more power. So having that extra headroom from a quality power supply, it's going to give you a little bit more longevity for your system. It's one piece that you won't have to replace, and you can squeeze more power from upgrades in future. Replace a video card. Put in a new CPU with more cores perhaps. The next step is choosing what CPU you're going to use. And for this build, I am going to use a little bit older CPU, but since for this build I already had a motherboard that supports it, I chose the i7 8700 processor. This means it's an 8th generation processor, and they are on 13th generation processor, but I saved a few dollars by going with this used processor. The specifications are, it has 6 physical cores, and it has what's called hyper-threading, so that it's able to execute 6 more threads, 12 threads in total, which means it can process more instructions. And I figure 6 cores is plenty of power for this system. It's a middle of the road. It's your Ryzen system as well. And those are chips from AMD, which is another CPU maker and competitor to Intel. Any one you choose for the middle of the road PC will be fine, and it really kind of depends on what you can get for your money. Sometimes the cost will be a factor in what you decide. For instance, you need to match up your CPU with your motherboard. Your motherboard needs to be compatible with your CPU. And to take some of that choice or confusion out of it, sites like Amazon or Newegg have what's called a component and matcher utility. And it states which chip or RAM will match up with your motherboard. So you don't choose a processor that won't fit in your system. Now this is going a little bit above and beyond what this beginner's build might entail, but it's something you might need to know. If you're going my route and putting in an 8th or 9th gen CPU into the motherboard that I already have this board, so I'm trying to save money. The downfall, the caveat is it's probably not going to have too much support in the near future because it's already been out for a number of years. For this build, I have the Z390 Aurora Gigabyte motherboard. Now, this is pretty much one of the higher end motherboards back in the day, and it can fit a 9th gen Intel CPU. This is a socket 1155 for the chip set, and What's special about this? Well, it has built-in Wi-Fi, USB 3.0. It has 3 NVMe slots, and it also has 3 PCI Express 16 slots. Now, some of that may not mean too much to a beginner. Let's just put it in easy terms to understand. There's plenty of room to expand on this motherboard. We're going to start out with one hard drive, which we'll call an NVMe, which is a super fast hard drive, an SSD. And then down the line, if we want more storage, we can either hook up 2 more NVMe's, or we can plug in a traditional SSD hard drive because it has 6 SATA ports on the board as well. The next component we're going to talk about is RAM. Currently, we're on DDR5. This is DDR4, and a lot of motherboards still use it. And you can get it in varying speeds as well, and sizes. But what you really want to do is use your configuration tool on Amazon or your other site you're purchasing it from, and make sure it is compatible with your motherboard. Meaning, does your board take DDR4? Does it take DDR5? You need to know that. If it takes DDR4, will it be compatible with an Intel chipset or the AMD? Typically, there's a lot of memory out there that'll support both of them, but just make sure. This one has an Intel, supports i7 and Core i9 on it. So for this board, you want to run what's called dual channel, which means you need a 2-paired kit, 8 gig one stick, 8 gig another stick, and put them in the corresponding matching slots. And I'll show you how to do that. They run in dual channel, and it's important to do that to maximize speed. The next component would be your video card. In the middle of the range computer, you need a little bit more power than the entry level. And we're going to go with a powerful card, but that's been out for a while. We're going with a Radeon 580 8GB card. You can probably pick these up on eBay for $100 or less. Now you could go with Radeon 5500 XT or 5600 XT. But those are going to cost you about $150 to $180, but you can get them new. This one is used, and I got this used for $70. And it should be able to play some of the newer titles at 1080p without breaking a sweat. If you use video editing, your video editing program should be able to leverage some of the video card rendering support in it as well. Now, you need a good cooler if you have one of these CPUs that are running 6-core, 8-core CPUs. If it overheats, the system's gonna break, basically. And you need it to keep it cool to keep functioning, because when it's going, playing that high-end game you love, or editing or rendering a video, it's going to produce more heat. This is an entry-level cooler, but it's done the job on a few of other PCs I've had. It's made by ID Cooling, and you can get a Hyper 212 and another brand, which is excellent, and you can scale up and up and up in price, but this will cost you about $24. It comes with a kit. It sits on the top of your CPU here, and you always have to take the sticker off before you put it on, and then you secure it with mounting brackets, and you'll need thermal paste, but most of the kits will come with that in here, and your screws and stuff. But if not, then you'll need to buy some like Arctic Silver or another brand, because even though you have a heatsink, you need a way to kind of like transfer that heat from metal of your CPU to the metal here and the heat pipes. And that's where thermal paste comes in, and that's what that does. Last but not least, you need a place to put all of your computer parts in, and we have a case. Now you also have to be considerate of choosing your case, because motherboards come in different sizes. They come in a mini or micro ATX boards, which is a small form factor meant for a small case. And then this one, which is a full ATX board, is quite a bit larger. If you want to have a small profile PC, you're going to be limited on some of your expansion capabilities. It's not going to have as many ports and such. It also takes up a smaller footprint, which means if you have a desktop, it's not going to be this ginormous case. So you have to think about that, and you have to match it appropriately. This here is a fractal design focus case. They have it in black and blue and white. I chose blue. It has a see-through case so you can see all your components and lights if you have them. It has ports on the top for your USB ports and audio and power button and all that good stuff. And you'll see on the back, you'll have your ports for where your motherboard I/O input output comes out here, where you plug in your USBs, and over here is where your video card will slot into and you'll plug in your monitor. And on the bottom is a spot to put your power supply. And when we build it, we're going to go in depth about what to do, where to place the components. Now I chose this case because it looked cool, but it also had good reviews and it fits an ATX full-size motherboard, but it also can fit micro ATX as well. But not only that, but it came with 2 cooling fans in the front. Keeping your PC cool inside as well is important because components run hot. Step 2, assembling your PC. Once you have all your components gathered, you're going to want to start setting up and building your PC. Let's get to it. Your first step would be to open up the lock mechanism for your particular motherboard, and usually it's just a small clip here that unclips and you can flip this retainer shield up. The next phase would be to look on your motherboard, and there should be an arrow right here. On this side you'll see an arrow and it points down, and this will correspond on how you're going to socket your chip, your CPU, into your motherboard. Your CPU should have an arrow corresponding on the CPU, in which you would place it directly in line with that other arrow. Now lightly make sure it's set in there, and then lower the containment mechanism on your chip and gently clamp it down so it's secure. Try to avoid touching your chip, your CPU, on the top metal part, because your fingers have oils and those oils can transfer to the metal faceplate and then cause it to heat up that much more quickly and diminish the cooling effects of your heatsink and cooler. If you did manage to touch it, or you bought a used chip and there's still residual thermal paste on the chip, you can clean it by using isopropyl alcohol with a cotton swab and cleaning it. Assemble your heatsink and cooler first. And every decent heatsink should come with a cooling fan that attaches to it. It should have instructions, and it'll tell you, according to your platform, Intel or AMD, whether it's an LGA 1700 or 1155, how to set it up and mount it on your motherboard, and it'll list all the components. The first step is to take their mounting bracket and line it up on the back of your motherboard, and then seat it into the holes, which sometimes is easier said than done. This one has strips of tape that you can use, but you flip it over, and then to the next step of putting your brackets on in the correct way, which would be these that came with it. And it should tell you we need gray standoffs, and then it says pay attention to the brackets, so that you either put it like this or like this. So just follow those directions, otherwise you could have issues. And they're gonna fit on top of the standoffs like that, and then you want to line them up 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, because you're going to mount these brackets on top of this like so, and then put the screw through into the hole. And keep in mind, if you're like me, you might need some magnifying glasses to see what the hell you're doing. And you'll need a small screwdriver to tighten these up into the backplate mount. I'm not going to torque them down, tighten them down super tight right now until I make sure that cooler fits on here properly. And then once I know it does and it lines up, then I can tighten them down appropriately. And this is why I said don't put your thermal paste on until you've got your brackets and everything set up and assemble your heatsink and fan assembly, because you're going to smush it around and you don't want to hit it by accident. So we'll just wait a little bit. Now that they're on here, not fully tightened, but you'll need to set up the rest of your fan. And this is here. And you'll see now that this is how this is going to sit on a chip, with this tightening screws fitting on the bolts right here that are raised up. And you want to make sure that it fits and that it kind of will sit directly on to the CPU and flat. So now that we know that is good, we want to tighten the rest of the CPU mounts down securely. And then we will proceed to take off the sticker. The sticker is what protects the copper heat pipes on the bottom that transfer the heat from the CPU into the fins and heatsink. Because if you don't take that off, it's not going to work properly and transfer the heat. The next step is to apply some thermal paste onto your CPU. And you want to make sure it's evenly applied, and some will come out faster than the others. Most people will say do a check mark and then smear it with a squeegee. You want to make sure that what you use is like plastic so you don't scratch the chip surface, and you can make sure that it covers the chip and you can squeegee it through on one direction. But you want to make it evenly across the whole chip. Don't get the thermal paste on your other components inside the unit. You want to make it an even layer, a nice thin even layer. And once you have that on there, you want to line up your cooler like this and make sure it's making contact with the CPU, and line up the screw holes like so. And once you get the first one in, right, lightly screw it in, probably like 2 screw turns, and then go over to the other side and make sure that you've lined it up as well, and screw it probably 2 to 3 turns, and do it the same and alternate between each one, slowly tightening down the heatsink a couple turns at a time so that you have even pressure across, and it slowly tightens against the CPU as it comes down. Once you've gotten to the end of how far it will tighten on any good CPU cooler, it will stop. You won't be able to tighten it any farther, and hand tightening is what you need to do. Do not use a electric screwdriver with this. Hand tighten it. That this is the next step, putting on your cooler fan. This one has LED plugins because it has LED lights, and if your board supports that, you can find the system fan plugin. Like there's one here, the system fans for the CPU cooler. There's a number of them, or a motherboard that supports LED, then you also want to look for that. This one has more fan headers down below here, so match them up accordingly. And when you mount your fan like this, make sure you have room to reach where your cords go to plug your fan in. You want to feed the retainer brackets through the front, all right? Make sure you have your cables to where you want them to go. They could go on the inside of here, and then you line it up here like so, like this. You want to just clip it onto the CPU cooler, just like this system. It just sits in place like that, and it's held onto the cooler like that. And you can cable manage these however you want, or not at all if you want a messy system, but you can. And I find that I can run these through prior to mounting them, sometimes it's easier, or after. If you look, if it's right here, and line up the pins, and it has a guider right here. Just put it in like that. And this particular board has another spot up here for down here for LED. It has one up here for LEDs, and they're pinned correctly. So if you want the LEDs and your board supports it, plug it in appropriately. Now that you've got that on, your next step would be to socket your RAM. Each motherboard has matching DIMM sockets to run in what's called dual channel. Look to your motherboard manual to find out which socket, whether it's 1, 3, 1, 2, or 1 or 2 and 4, however it is, and match it up appropriately so that you can run your RAM in what's called dual channel mode. You only will match up the pins one way and then press down till you hear it click, and you'll see that both sides have locked in now. Do the same for the second stick of RAM, or if you have 4, continue on. Once they're secured, you're ready to move on to the next step, which is the next step you want to do is to insert your NVMe drive. And this board has a couple of different slots, 3 to be exact. The top one is going to be a Gen 4 slot. You want to use that if you want the most speed, if you have a Gen 4 one here. These are a heatsink, and you can take the tape off, and it'll help to keep your NVMe cool. But there's some various spots here on the motherboard. You can see here, 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 and that's for where the screw goes to mount this through the little hole here and to keep it on the board. But here we are, this small little screw standoff. So you just kind of want to gauge which screw you should put this in. And get this little tiny screw, and it goes here, and it fits on the motherboard. And you screw it down, tighten it, then you can insert your NVMe drive, and it only goes one way, so you'll know if it goes in. You can see the slot, so insert, make a little clip, and then take your tiny NVMe screw and just attach it with the tiny NVMe screw into the stanchion that you just put on the board. For this instance, you can take off this tape, and then this will kind of like touch the NVMe, and it's kind of like a modified thermal tape kind of thing, and it'll help to transfer some of the heat from the NVMe to that, and then just secure aluminum cover like that. Now that you have your NVMe installed, your RAM installed, your heatsink and fan, now the next phase is to insert this into the case, the PC case. You want to take the front panel off of your case. Be careful, depending on what case you have. You may have glass, so it could break. And you want to probably take off the protective coating off of your door when you're done or ready to finish up your case. Inside most of your cases, you'll have a box with all of your screws to mount everything, your motherboard, and a few other things. Maybe even some cable ties, depending on what kind of case that you got and how expensive it is. This comes with some motherboard screws to screw the motherboard to the stanchions in the case, and some extra stanchions depending on how big your motherboard is. If it's an ATX, you'll need a bunch of these. And then some standard zip ties for tying up some cables and making it look nice. Don't lose these. We need those. And this had some 3.5-inch hard drive slots here for mounting your hard drives. If you have any mechanical drives or other, your PC motherboard is going to mount on top of this. Remove the back of the case as well. You're going to have to route cables and stuff, and it's easy to do that if you have the back of the case off. And here's what the back of this fractal case looks like. There's minimal room for routing cables, but it's a large area in the back. Let's lay this down. Next phase, you're going to need the screws and the mounting stanchions from the box that came with your case. And typically there'll be letters on your case that say for A or for ATX and M for micro ATX, and that's where you would typically put your stanchions into the board. Now we have an ATX board, so we have to put them in the A slots here, and normally you just want to hand tighten these really tight and make sure they're flush when you tighten them. Flush meaning they're tight against the case so they don't raise one side of your motherboard higher than the other. And you may need a small tool to tighten these, and I have this handy toolkit. In fact, the little screwdriver bits that can fit onto some of these stanchions, in fact, makes it easier. You can just use those. Just don't overdo it, because you can strip the thin metal and then you won't be able to mount your motherboard appropriately. The next step is to remove some of the tied cables so you can get them out of your way and give yourself a little bit more room to mount your motherboard. You'll have to uncable them later anyways, because you'll need to run the cables to the respective ports on the board. Sometimes motherboards have shields. It's called I/O shields built into them like this. This one doesn't need an I/O shield. Some boards come with metal I/O shields that you have to put on first. This one you don't. Make sure you line up all your holes. And the thing goes here for the motherboard, and then you just put it gently in and line up your stanchions for where your board is supposed to mount. You'll see the screw holes, and it should line up to where you put them on your motherboard. And they should all match up to the corresponding holes here. Now, once you do that, you need to find the appropriate screws that came in your case and tighten down them into the stanchions to secure your motherboard. Now, once you have all of your screws securing your motherboard in place, you want to start hooking up your various cables. Some of these will be for audio ports in the front of your case and the top sometimes as well. But most importantly, you'll have your on and off switch. So when you press your power from the case, it actually turns on the computer. You also have a reset switch. And then you'll have to refer to your motherboard in which places they go. But generally, they're down in the bottom right hand corner. This will usually be the USB 3.0 plug, and it should fit in the corresponding slotted on your motherboard. In this case, we routed it from behind the board here, underneath here, took it up. Now, that's really close to where the power supply is going to be, so we got to make sure that there's plenty of room and it doesn't interfere. Otherwise, we might have to change how we routed this and bring it down here. But we'll see. But before we put in the power supply, we have two case fan wires that need to be put in. They are up here on the bottom of the board as well, and they are slotted so you know which way to put them in as well. You don't want the cables flopping around to get in your fan blades. That would be pretty bad. But usually you wait for cable management to the end. See, there's these here, and that's where you would attach cabling to. But you want to wait till you're all set up and everything's run properly and you know it looks good and it can reach before you do that, because you might have to move things around. The next step is to install your power supply. You should put your cables for the power supply nearest the motherboard back plate here, so that you can feed them through the back and route them on the back of the case in the motherboard, so that you can have more room with your cabling. Now, line up your holes in the back of your case here with the screw holes for the power supply and secure it with the screws that came in your case box. Make sure not to thread the screws incorrectly because you don't want to strip these. You might have to move the power supply a little bit in order to line up your screws. Once you've gotten your power supply secured to your case, now it's time to route your cables. You will need the CPU power pin here, which is a typical 8 pin and a couple 4 pins, depending on your motherboard. It could use all of them or just one of them. And then the 24 pin ATX connector, which connects right to your motherboard, and it's pinned like this with a clip that goes only one way. And you want to connect it into your motherboard like so and line it up, and it only goes one way. Press gently down until you hear a click and it's secured. Now sometimes you may have a long enough cable for your CPU power to go through the back of the case and route in the back like this. It needs to come through here, right up here. And that's why you need to give as much length to the cables as you can by putting the power supply with the cables closest to the outlet in the back of the case. Because this one up here to mount to the CPU 8 pin or 4 pin is a little tricky, but again, it has a clip and it's keyed and it'll only fit one way because it's essential. Because certain modern day CPUs will take more power and they'll need this plug. So we'll socket this, and it's the same thing. It'll make a small click and you'll know it's secure. Now you're going to be thinking, well, what is all this left over? What am I going to do with this? You do need some of these cables. Specifically, you need 6-pin, 8-pin PCIe slot power connectors. What do you need these for? These are essential because the next step, we're going to put in our graphics card. We usually use this first slot here unless something is preventing it from going the full length. And you'll see why. For this build, we have a RX 580 8GB GDDR5 card, and it is a few years old, but it's still very capable, and you can get them for a decent price, between $70 and $130 used, maybe even new. Just shop around. As you can see, it's fairly large card. It has DisplayPort out, DVI out, and a HDMI port. So it has what you need. And we line up the card with the slot here. Make sure the cables are out of the way. And then we will line it up so it goes in without a lot of force. You don't want to force it. If you do, you could damage something. So just make sure nothing's impeding it from going in. I put the video card down here. It just lined up a little bit better. And I have 3 16x PCI Express slots, so it's good to go. Putting back on the little case protector slot things, keep the airflow going out in one direction and maximize the heat exhaust. Now you have to secure your graphics card into the case itself with these thumb screws. Sometimes you can use the thumb screws with your actual thumb, but sometimes it's hard to get to in the slot, so that's where your little magnetic screwdriver comes in handy. You've got your 6-pin to 8-pin PCI Express power. We're gonna slide it through the back of the case again to try to hide some of the cabling because there's a lot of it here. And then we'll bring it through the front. You have your fans for your graphics card here. So when you're routing cables, make sure you get the cables out of the way of the fan blades. This one's fine. And this is keyed as well, and you'll hear it click. Now that that's in, graphics card's in, we'll move on to the next part. What we have left is the remaining cables for your SATA power supply plugins and maybe a random Molex 4-pin here and there. And for this build, we won't need them, but we might need them in future builds. So we kind of want to be able to cable manage them, so to speak, and get them out of the way so we can provide airflow for our graphics card. Now this case has a bay here. We could just stuff them in here, but maybe we want to tie them up tight first and make it a little neater. It really depends on where you can put the cables. These fit in here and they're out of the way. Now if you had a modular power supply, you might not have all these extra connectors, but they cost more, and this one was on sale. So you wouldn't have these because they wouldn't be plugged in. You can plug in what you need with a modular power supply again. So, thought I knew better, but I didn't refer to the manual when I inserted the memory. And it's supposed to be an A2 slot and a B2 slot when you're booting up from 2 sticks of RAM. And I got a C1 error code when booting up to go to the BIOS. So, reconfigured that. Now's the time that you need to go over to Microsoft.com and download Windows 11 or 10, depending on what you want. This is where we're going to use our USB stick so we can create an installation media to install our operating system on our brand new computer. Select to create Windows 11 installation media here and download now. Once it's downloaded, execute it. You can also download the individual ISO image for 64-bit device, and you can use another tool like Rufus to create an installation media if you want. Once you have the Windows 11 media creation tool downloaded, double click on it, say yes, and then it will start the process. So you want to say accept, and then make sure it has Windows 11 or 10, whatever you chose. And then unclick that because this is for your new PC, and then select next. In this case we're going to use a USB flash drive, and like it states here, it has to be at least 8 gig. Click next. Make sure that this is the USB drive that you want to use because it's going to erase it, okay? Click next. Now it's going to download the Windows 11 ISO image, and it's going to erase and write that image to the USB drive that you have plugged into your computer, and it's going to tell you when it's done. And then you'll be ready to plug it into your new computer USB port and set your BIOS settings to boot from USB, and then start your computer and boot from the new USB you just created with Windows 11 and start the installation process. And once it's complete, just click finish. So now that your computer is all put together, it's time to turn it on and make sure everything powers on and works. Once that's done, we're going to go into the BIOS and set the system to boot from USB. And this is where your USB media for Windows 10 or 11 comes in handy, because that's what you created and that's what you're going to boot the system up off of and install your operating system. Not only that, but when you're in the BIOS, you want to select the XMP memory settings to maximize your speed for your memory timings. And also, if you want to select one more thing, you want to make sure AHCI is selected for newer systems, and that maximizes the speed of your hard drive interface. So let's get it started up. Plug in the USB into a fast port and go into the BIOS. Normally your BIOS key would be F10, delete key, or F2, depending on your motherboard manufacturer. So look into your manual or online and you'll find out what key to hit. So we're in the BIOS and our initial settings is to boot from USB. We need to set that up, and for certain things you might need to switch from easy mode to optimize defaults, etc. Memory frequency is not running at optimal, so what we need to do is switch those timings and boot from USB. And in this case we can drag it up to the top, and now we need to go. So you want to go and hit F12 key on your keyboard after you set up your BIOS to boot from USB, and select the USB stick. You know, it may not be F12 on your motherboard, but double check your manual or the website for your motherboard maker. Click your USB stick, and we're going to be hopefully booting into Windows 10 in a minute here. Here we go. Go ahead and click next, English, depending on what your language is. Install now, and then if you don't have an install key, say I don't have a product key, Most Windows 10 or 11 will let you install and use it, but it'll have a watermark down in the corner, which is irritating, but it won't really interfere with too much functionality. And you can purchase a key online if you need to do that. So we'll click, I don't have a key, or if you have a key, you can enter it there. I'm doing Windows 10 Pro for this instance here. Next, and then accept license agreement. For this, I'm going to do a custom install because this primary drive here, my NVMe, had an OS before, so I'm just going to delete the partitions and delete them all. So it's one big space and go new, and then just use a default amount of 500 gig. Apply and say okay, and it'll create the partitions it needs to work, and select next. And then Windows will copy over all the files that you created with the Windows Installation Media Tool, and it'll get ready to install Windows 10 for you, or 11. And if you have your network cable or Ethernet connected, hardwired if you have one, when you're doing this, sometimes it'll pull down updates as it's doing the install. So it's just a tip. I'll let this go, and there'll be a few prompts that'll require you to enter information or join it to a Windows or Microsoft account rather. So enter those as needed. Just follow the instructions. If you don't want to connect it to your Microsoft account, just select offline account down here. You can always set it up later and choose limited experience, because this will just give you a bunch of stuff that you may or may not want. And then you're going to have to put a name on the computer and a logon password, since you said offline account. And then you've got all the privacy settings, location, diagnostic. I turn this off. It just can be a little bit overwhelming and annoying at times. And then you'll continue on and choose what you want. I don't want Cortana. Cortana is an online help. It's kind of like Siri in its own way, but I turn it off. Your next step is you want to go over to motherboard manufacturer, which is this case Gigabyte. And you want to download the chipset drivers for your motherboard. And when you're on the site, you're going to put in your service and support, and then you want to put in your model name for your motherboard. In this case, it would be Z390 motherboard. And then search for it, and it should come up with your motherboard, and then you should all your drivers for your operating system, your audio and chipset support, so that you make sure that you get everything working perfectly stable and fine. So download those. Install your motherboard chipset drivers first. Then download your graphics card driver from AMD or NVIDIA and install that after your system's updated and patched. Check Windows updates. Make sure that's all set. You might have to reboot as needed, but that's normal. And once that's done, you can install your graphics card drivers and install a couple games and test out your brand new computer. See how it performs. Now that the system's up and running and all the drivers are installed, you can pull up the AMD Adrenalin software, and you can see that we're running at 3.2 gigahertz, 6 cores, 12 threads, 16 gig of RAM, and we have RX 580 with 8 gig of RAM, GDDR5. You can tweak some settings and etc. If you have a Steam account, you can install Steam, get some games set up so that you can play and test out your system, which we'll be doing in a minute. And if everything is good, we'll know that our computer we just built for the first time is good to go. So we're gonna play some Witcher 3 Enhanced Edition. So I'm unlimited frames. We'll go full screen. See what we can do here. So up here, I've enabled the settings, and we're running at 60 FPS, frames set to unlimited. This is the intro scene beginning. Running pretty good.
Past as beautiful as ever.
In order to get through here and into the main section of the game, you got to complete a few tasks. talk to people, and then it'll go on to the main story. Excellent system, running great. And if you want to play other games, I think you'll have no problem doing so. Within reason, you might have to lower your resolution or your eye candy for your graphics settings, but this system, medium the road settings, you have room to breathe and you can play most of the things your friends can, and you don't need to have the top of the line system as I just showed you. Test another item here. It's called Cinebench, and it will stress your system and it'll give you a score at the end. Tests your CPU and your GPU and how fast it can render. And I've got the utility up here. It tells you the temperature of your GPU and tells you the utilization of your CPU and how much RAM and GPU power is pulling. All that good stuff. So, and at the end, it'll give me a score, and you can compare it to other users' PCs and see how yours scores. It's called Cinebench R23. And this computer setup got 8,721 score and Cinebench R23, and it sits right below an 8-core Ryzen 7 1700, slightly below an i9 9800 chip. It's pretty respectable. And what is Davinci's Resolve? Well, it's a free video editing software. Very full-featured, and if you're interested, you can head on over to Davinci's Resolve and download it for free and use it. So once we've installed the program called Davinci Resolve and do a quick setup, I'm not going to go into a full tutorial, but if you've used one of these programs before, like Adobe Premiere Pro, Final Cut, you can select that. It will set your presets up for your keyboard so that it's like the program you used before, thereby lessening the learning curve you need for this program. I'm just going to import a couple clips from a previous video. Just import what video that you want to compile or edit. You can drag and drop it onto the timeline, and you can scrub through this video just like you would. And scrubbing through a video and how fast the particular program can cope with that is a indication of how well your CPU and system can handle that. So it's scrubbing pretty good. It's playing well. And the other thing is it's responsive, and that's what you want. You want to find out how long it takes to export like this 12-minute video, 10-minute video, and we want to do it at 1080p format at a video codec of 264 compression, and then here, render all. It will start rendering, and it says it's about 10 minutes. That's not really that bad. If you really want to see what's going on, pull up Task Manager, more details, go to Performance, and then you can see while it's rendering that all 6 cores, 12 threads being pegged. CPU is running at ramped up to 4.2 gigahertz, and that's what it does when it needs that speed bump. And we're using 8 gig of the 16 gig of memory, so it's pretty good and it's handling it well. 9% of video remaining, 10%. It's really cruising along. And if you know anything about rendering video, you'll know that 1080p 4K video takes a lot of horsepower to render. You need a fast machine. This mid-range PC that we've built here, our first computer, your first computer, you can edit and export your own video. You can play a good range of titles on here. It's got plenty of power. Now, if you want, you can choose a Ryzen 5600G. That's a 6-core, the AM4 platform, and it's affordable, and that's a good decision in my mind too. If you haven't checked out my video about gaming with just using the Ryzen 5600G onboard graphics, check that out. My final thoughts are, if you follow this video step by step, I might have put a little bit more information in there, but that was for a reason, so you can be educated on what things do in your computer. But I hope with this video I've helped you build your own PC, and by building your own PC you get upgradability, you get quality components, expand the life by putting in a new video card down the road, more memory, maybe a faster SSD. With a higher end PC you're not just limited to web browsing, you can do tons of things. And off-the-shelf Dell or HP, I'm not going to knock them. A lot of them are pretty good, but you're not really sure what kind of components are in there. Sometimes the BIOS is a little bit no frills and you can't do too much. And they might give you like a entry-level power supply with not a lot of headroom. But at least when you're building your own PC, you know what you put in there. And you built it yourself, you know everything's going to match up and work together right. So congratulations, you built your first PC. Thanks for watching. Remember this tech.